Welcome everyone to this webinar on literature reviews, in which I'm going to present a worked example of undertaking a scoping review on the topic of education and post-independent Indian diaspora. Jonathan's introduced me. My name is Rita Chawla-Duggan and I'm from the University of Bath. But why this topic? Well, aside from personal curiosity, being a first-generation post-independence diaspora, in the area of scholarship, there is a rapidly developing literature on the Indian diaspora, in which Asian Indians living in Western European countries are receiving, especially in the US, are receiving the most scholarly attention. Now, Gorbichan, he categorizes Indian diasporas into 4 categories, of which post-colonial independence migrants is a highly distinctive category. Now, the question of what a migrant is another question altogether, which we won't go into today. But this category is quite distinctive in the sense that the studies seem to show, the data seems to show that they have been rapidly educated as post-independence diaspora, but it's been accompanied with advancement in all areas of society, with first generations, and this is what's unique, preserving their Indianness outside India. However, the concern is, or my concern is, whether subsequent Indian diasporic generations will meet their cultural aspirations or be disadvantaged by a potential learning loss of their heritage. Now, this concern was reinforced in 2024 when I visited a school which was representative of an academy trust which had begun to address this issue across the country. I'd initially had conversations with them in 2023 and actually visited one of their settings in 2024. And the impetus for their schooling curriculum started on the basis that they felt the needs of the diasporic communities were not being met in terms of cultural heritage. So there's a lot of scope in this sort of work, which is why I thought I'd start looking at what we're doing in the academic field when it comes to this area. Well, the first question is, what counts as diaspora? And I have a definition here from the Indian government, and it's quite a broad definition because it includes not only people who are Indian citizens living abroad temporarily or permanently, but also OCIs, overseas citizens of India, and PIOs and NRIs. These are persons of Indian origin and non-resident Indians. So it's also by descent that one is categorized as a member of the Indian diaspora from the Indian government's perspective. So the figures, let's have a look at what the figures are. You can see historically who counts as Indian diaspora. We have from post-independence, so independence, for those of you who don't know, from British rule was in 1947, August 1947. So from there, we have around 3 to 5 million in 1950 to 51. And that then, we don't have any data according to Jen's research. We don't have any data for the 50s and 60s, but we see that by 1970s, the numbers have increased to 5.6 million. This is globally. And in 1981, 12.9 million more than 50% residing in Asian countries, but mainly Nepal. But outside India, we're really referring to the UK and USA. When we come to, when we come to the next century, we begin in 2001 with 16.8 million, and I've broken it down in terms of Britain and USA, and you can see those figures. By the time we get to 2021, globally we're at 53 million, and that includes all of the members that I mentioned earlier, OCIs and PIOs and overseas students. And in the UK, we have almost 2 million in the population, making them a highly visible category in our country. So what I'm going to do today is talk about this literature review. The focus is methodological rather than the findings, although I will give some insight into some of the findings towards the end. I'm going to introduce you to how I used the 5-stage framework suggested by Arksey and O'Malley for conducting a scoping review. I'll introduce you to the framework. The body of the presentation will be on the worked example, where I looked at what the literature was telling us about the post-independence Indian diaspora and education. I highlight the challenges I had during the search of the literature, how I synthesized it, and provide some practical advice for doctoral students on doing their literature reviews and who are considering a scoping review. So why a scoping review? For this literature review, I adopted the notion of a scoping review because scoping reviews take stock of a body of literature on a broad topic in terms of its characteristics, features, conceptual boundaries, main areas of agreement, and also tensions. And I was quite interested in the idea of tensions. Two further characteristics of this review is that it is conceptual in the sense that it begins to conceptualize, as a result of the analysis, it begins to conceptualize diaspora as a framework of dimensions. Secondly, it also identifies the themes from which the dimensions start to emerge. So the themes start to form the basis for conceptualizing diaspora generally, and then the Indian diaspora in particular. Finally, the methodology uses a systematic approach in the way I do the searches, rather than a traditional view of what a systematic literature review is. And this systematic approach involves also a series of iterative stages designed to reduce bias and increase the transparency of my decision-making. So Arksey and O'Malley present a 5-stage framework that's listed on this slide for conducting a literature review. The method adopted needs to achieve both depth and broad results, I would say. So rather than being guided by a highly focused reference, research question, like you might find in some certain systematic reviews, this is quite a broad question. The research question is quite broad. And I identify relevant literature regardless of the research design. Whilst I make a note of the research design, that's not my primary interest. I'm trying to chart the landscape really of the literature when I'm thinking about the scoping review. It's not a linear process, but iterative, as I've said before. So I respond to each stage in a reflexive way. And where necessary, I repeat steps to ensure the literature is covered in a comprehensive way. So the research question for this literature review was deliberately broad, allowing me to reflect on the past in relation to the future and the concerns for subsequent generations in terms of what I'd been introduced to, both at the setting I'd visited, but also my own pure personal curiosity. So these are the two questions. What does academic literature tell us historically about the educational experiences of post-independence Indian diaspora? And what's the potential for global Indian communities? So for identifying relevant studies, I adopted a strategy that involved searching for research evidence via different sources. And these are the range of different sources I used in terms of databases. I initially conducted a search through EBSCO, which is an umbrella sort of database for those of you who aren't familiar with it. It's a provider of databases offering multiple databases, which therefore allow a search for several databases about a topic. Then I also selected through individual databases specific to education. And some of those, the literature that came up was repeated, and some of them were in addition. And also, I wanted to include both published and unpublished data eventually. So I included thesis as well, a PhD thesis. Right, now I know you won't see the small print here, but it's the issue that I'm trying to raise that's more important. So when you see these screenshots, it's the numbers from S1 to S5, for example. It's relevant in this search. So when I started doing the EBSCO search, the first search, I initially carried out 14 searches. So I've called them S1 to S14. And the screenshot is of the first 5 searches to demonstrate how I was trying to be systematic. So in S1, I began the search with key terms alongside the word "and" as a Boolean operator. Boolean operators are joining words. A Boolean operator allows me to combine search terms, so post-independence and India and diaspora. I chose all the databases under EBSCO, but I limited the search to peer-reviewed materials. So I wanted the search to be, at this stage, peer-reviewed documents. And all the material, initially I had put 1947 to 2023, but the system would not accept 1947s for some reason. And so I had to go, I did eventually look at that gap through Google Scholar, but this system was stopping me at 1970, I think it was. That was my time range, if you like, 1970 to 2023. I used what's called an expander, as it searches out related or equivalent words to the ones that I'd chosen. In the BEI, which is at one of the databases within EBSCO, British Educational Index, you can actually ask for special limiters for education levels and ages. So I chose all in those categories, even for this, because I knew it would work. And I also wanted to see where the focus of research was in terms of age levels. But as you can see, by the time I get to S5, we don't get to any results until S5. So 1 to 4, there's no results. Now, what had gone wrong? Well, in S2, so in S1, I said I'd use the Boolean operator, and I just said post-independence and India and diaspora. In S2, I decided, okay, I'll use what's called natural language. It's referred to as a smart text search because it allows you to put in a sentence and leave the database to pick out the keywords. It also allows me to compare in a systematic way results from using the Boolean operator compared to smart text. As you can see in S2, there's no results. S3 and S4, I decided not to include dates this time, but also compare the Boolean and the smart text to see if that would alter the results. As you can see, no results. By S5, I reduced search terms to diaspora and India, and I removed post-independence, but retaining the same limiters of peer-reviewed and expanders for related and equivalent terms. I was finding from this strategy that there were more results. And as you can see, you might be able to see there are 12 results there in S5. Because a scoping review is an iterative process, I read those 12 abstracts from those 12 papers. 6 of them were on Tibetan diaspora. 2 of them were on business and Ethiopian diaspora. And the remaining were relevant. So what did I do then? I decided to use what's called truncation. And that's really about allowing for variations of the word diaspora. So I used a truncation, a tool often used in searching literature bases, and I truncated diaspora for diaspora with a little asterisk. That's how it tends to show it, to ensure the database searched for variations of the word. Doing the truncation did actually broaden the results. And as you can see from you might be able to see the number, S6 was 16. Some of them, which were, when I looked at them again, because it's an iterative process, some of them were Tibetan diaspora. Actually, let me go back to this bit. Yeah. In S7, you can see it's increased to 27. What had happened? I limited the search term. I included the truncated term diaspora and the search term India, and I limited the search to peer-reviewed and expander, which was related words. I also added, this is where it's different here, TX to diaspora this time, and this is a possible explanation for the increase in numbers in S7 because TX functions to search the whole text, not just the abstracts. Again, when I looked at the abstracts, several of the papers were about Tibet. At one point, I wondered whether I should be shifting my project to the Tibetan diaspora. But anyway, I stuck with it. After removing those papers and taking account of any papers provided in the earlier section, I ended up with 6 papers. But you can see in S8, something happens. In S8, the numbers started to increase, and I'm not sure why that happened actually, but I think it's because I introduced TX in India and I got a huge plethora of papers as a result, because there were many papers that were looking at India, but they weren't necessarily relevant, and they were started to become too difficult to manage with that high number. So I thought, okay, what do I do now? I do need to look at this in relation to education. So let's start bringing in education at this point. I wanted to look at diaspora, Indian diaspora in relation to education. And in particular, I was interested in the curriculum or knowledge. So I added a truncated term for curriculum with the Boolean operator and curriculum, or to expand on curriculum, giving the choices of knowledge, instruction, teaching, learning, epistemic. I also included TX for curricula, and its alternative terms to search whole texts. As you can see, there were 2,245. So again, starting to get a bit too difficult to manage. And that's one of the problems with doing a scoping review. So when related to the educational terms I had chosen, results became unmanageable. The question for me was, what search terms to include, exclude, to make things more manageable. So in S10, I decided to remove TX again for diaspora, India, and curricula, so that the search would only look at the keywords and abstracts rather than the whole text. This made the results manageable for me, and as you can see, there were 77 results. Again, when I looked at them, the abstracts, many of them related to the Tibetan diaspora. Now, these are the final searches I did for EBSCO. And this is really about being iterative and for inclusion and exclusion. In S11, search 11, given I had noticed several of the papers were about Tibetan diaspora, I used the Boolean operator and the term not Tibet to remove papers relating to Tibet. In S12, I also decided to truncate Tibet with the Boolean operator not, and this result reduced the results significantly to 59 papers. You can see that in S12. Then I decided to expand on India by using the Boolean operator or Indian, and this increased the results to 156. So I'm getting closer to the context I'm after. However, when I read the titles, the data search had produced additional papers relevant to North American Indians, which of course wasn't the population's demographic I was interested in for this study. In S14, search 14, therefore, I added to the search term the Boolean operator and Asia or Asian to avoid searching the North American Indian populations. By S14, search 14, the initial EBSCO search produced 34 papers. Now, I decided to repeat the whole search with those individual databases, which I'm not going to go through in detail today, but I will give you a flavour. So this is the British Educational Index, and you can see for the first four, again, I repeated the same process again as I had for EBSCO, with the same search terms, the same truncations, the same exclusion and inclusion elements. And for the first four, there were no results, and then we start getting some results again. I did add the filter for this one, all education levels and all age group levels. Again, there was a huge increase in results. And you can see that by S14, we're at 187,408. Far too many to be manageable. So nearly, 200,000 results. The same problem occurred with the US education source. In fact, it was more, because most of the studies are done in the USA. There's actually very little in the UK, and that's one of the gaps that emerged from this literature review. The issue again was a very high number of Tibetan papers on the Tibetan diaspora, and when education terms were, no, hang on, that's not for this one. When I included some of the expansive terms, there are quite a few irrelevant papers. Adding Asian reduced the volume of results because, as you can imagine, given it's an American database, there would be a high number of papers on North America Indian population. So how did I start to really, really reduce things? I repeated that process with all the databases. And then I went back to EBSCO, and I decided if the numbers were so high, what would I do to start to reduce them? One of the first things I started to do was actually change the order of the words. That made a huge difference. So when I changed the order of the words for EBSCO, and this was the final string I ended up with, or the original string after I'd done all the truncations, I had diaspora or Indian and knowledge or instruction or teaching, and not Tibet. I had 386, and that was diaspora generally. It wasn't necessarily focused highly on the Asian Indian diaspora. But when I started to change the order of the words, I then got 614 for that day, because obviously things increase by the day. So I have an ongoing reminder, shall we say, which tells me when there's been new papers come through. So I ended up with a string which was India or Indian, and that was first, and then specifying Asia or Asian, and then identifying different aspects to do with education. I also included the word immigrant, migrant, because I realized that diaspora might not have been a term used several years ago. It tends to be more, even though the actual term comes from the Greek, to spread or scatter. In the academic literature, it tends to be used more in more recent years. Anyway, the final results in the term were, for that string, were 614. So the search strategy, in terms of an evolution, if you like, was to use the Boolean logic of and or not, to truncate and use exclusion criteria as an iterative process. When I started off with post-independence and India and diaspora, there was nothing. And indeed, my PhD student had gone to look, and she said, Rita, there's nothing there. There's nothing coming up, which is why I had to look at it in more depth. But when I started to expand the keywords and the exclusions, I did get 34 results. But finally, after a long process, ended up with 614. But that wasn't the end of the story. I mean, this includes some of the inclusion-exclusion criteria, but I'm tempted to say, with a scoping review, it's better to think about the inclusion and exclusion criteria as you're going along, rather than predefined, as part of the iterative process of reading some of the results as they emerge. However, from that 614, I think it was, yes, from EBSCO, I needed to really find out which journals is it referring to, or where is it, which database is it referring to, because EBSCO is an umbrella, as I said at the beginning. And I decided to check the composition of EBSCO in terms of which databases most of the 614 papers were located. A high proportion of them were located in several health and economics databases. And I took a screenshot so you can see. So I then ticked off only what was relevant. I excluded, in other words, the databases from certain databases from this search, and that resulted in 406 papers. Having excluded the databases being searched and included the reordered current string of search terms, I also decided to exclude the places in EBSCO. So, and that entailed excluding its fields. And you can see here, all I've asked it to look at is in terms of title, abstract, and subject terms, rather than all the areas. And this reduced my results to 172. That's a screenshot of the title, abstract, subject terms as a way of excluding some papers. I then read all the abstracts for those 172, removing any papers that were irrelevant to the topic. I mean, in some of them, I did actually read the full papers, but it's quite easy to tell when it's talking about health-related problems, for example, and that's not really the focus of the work that I was interested in. And the 85 results were inserted into an Excel sheet, which I then, and then I read the abstracts to those. And that's generally the process I've gone through before getting to the substantive findings. And I did a thematic analysis, a qualitative analysis, on the basis of those papers that I read. And there were certain tensions that were emerging. I mean, I've identified three main themes: identity formation and educational infrastructure. And the themes that they were related to were strongly to do with identity and to do with language policies. There's a very strong concern in the literature in terms of cultural heritage preservation. And those tend to be conceptualized in terms of some form of assimilation or adaptation. And there is an emerging body of literature within that on embodied knowledge as well. And finally, there were tensions when it came to realizing educational expectations from the Indian diasporic perspective and navigating their way through those realizations. But that's not where the story ended, because I thought, well, what could I do with this to take it to a higher level of abstraction before then starting to think about the kinds of questions or possibilities there are in terms of pieces of research. I started to look at this, the different papers, and noticed that they could be seen in terms of space and time and knowledge, and how people come to know their Indianness, if you like, which I call time, space, and episteme. And I've talked about it at a more philosophical level in a forthcoming book called Colonization and Decolonization. There's a chapter in there, and it's forthcoming on the Indian diaspora. But it's more of a philosophical level. I talk about it there. But in terms of this temporal dimension, what the themes tended to show that we don't know too much, actually, about the generational shifts that in terms of Indian diaspora. And of course, that becomes really important now where, with the advent of digital technology, and that we can communicate our cultural heritage in different ways. The spatial dimension was really about how policies can shape experience, if you like, for example, language. And the epistemic dimension was looking at how they come to know being Indian in the different ways. You can be Indian and not live in India, and actually live on a street that is totally Indian, next door to a temple, and you wouldn't know you weren't in India in some cases. So the key findings in terms of those components are really about starting to think about what are those challenges and opportunities for research, and the different ways of starting to understand how Indian diasporic and identity seems to be formed. So the gaps raised several questions about those three dimensions. For example, we don't have any longitudinal studies to track the long-term changes. There's very little literature that goes from 47 to 70. There's also very little in terms of spatial dimensions. So there's very little from the UK, in actual fact. And maybe that's because they've been successful, so it hasn't really caught our attention to say, well, they've done well, so we don't really need to research. But actually, there are aspects of that process that need to be understood. So comparative work, for example, across spatial dimensions would be helpful, I think. And in terms of the epistemological component, really starting to look at different ways in terms of pedagogical methods to address the problem of cultural knowledge. And of course, the second question I was grappling with was, what does all this mean for a global Indian community spread across the world? There is potential in terms of the temporal dimension for evolving an Indian identity over time. There are possibilities for developing context-specific but globally relevant educational approaches, and maybe a global knowledge base. I might be being a bit overambitious, but that reflects their diverse experiences. Each dimension, although I've pulled them out separately, seems to contribute insights to understanding the other, and in terms of the dimensions, and the way that education can play a part, potentially, for the Indian diaspora globally. In terms of a practical advice for doing a literature review, a scoping review, be reflexive and adaptable. Log every step. I always kept a notebook by me. Don't fear iteration, because that's part of the process of being able to really track the landscape, going backwards and forwards and asking those questions. It does, I believe, did help me to map areas I hadn't thought about. And I'm sure that they are valuable for interdisciplinary questions. it raised questions on the whole issue of migration for me, which I hadn't even thought about, migration studies in relation to what I was specifically looking at. So it did take me out of some blinkered vision, and be flexible within this sort of structured framework, but always try to be systematic. And on that note, I shall end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita. That was fascinating. It was fascinating to see the step-by-step procedure that you took to refine the search. I'm going to invite questions from the floor. I don't see any at the moment. Would anyone like to start us off?
I can ask a question.
Welcome to Angeline.
I wondered, you talked about, Rita, thank you very much for that presentation. Thank you for taking us through it step by step. And I think what was really interesting was seeing how just those changes in the search terms and strings made it such a massive difference really to the number of publications that were being identified through your searches. In particular, I wondered what was happening with when you said you changed, because like a big step was when you changed the order of the terms in the search string. And I just wondered if anyone knows why that is. I mean, it's definitely a good tip to try doing that when you're searching.
Yeah, I mean, I tried various things, and at the time, changing the order just seemed to make a difference. I don't know why. And I did also, I think, remove some of the expansive terms, like getting it to look at the whole text at the same time. So I think when the databases are looking at the whole paper, you're getting far more results, and that has a plus and a minus to it. I needed to make things manageable so that I can just see the landscape, if you like. So I think at that time I also probably removed the function which makes it look at the whole text, and that reduced things quite a bit. And it is a case of playing backwards and forwards. Well, you know, I'm supposing it's missing things, and let me look. But then you realise, well, hang on, this is becoming a bit too difficult to manage if I want to, in terms of my purpose.
I have another question as well, Rita. So I noticed that the intersectionality with education, that didn't kind of come into play till some of your further refinements. Was that deliberate to put that kind of?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Well, I think very early on, before I sort of started to log, I did put education in and nothing was coming up. So I thought, okay, let me just start simply and just see what we've got on the Indian, Indian diaspora. But I think the more detailed work, once I started to include the education, I had to start to be quite careful in terms of the terms I was putting in relation to education, because I think it was in the American, when I started to look at the US education source, there were so many papers related to knowledge, but it wasn't knowledge that was relevant to this particular area. And at that point, I think, and I didn't mention this, but I changed it to schooling. And that reduced it a little bit. But of course, there was still quite a large number. But then again, I thought to myself, oh, is it relating to Indian in terms of the North American terms? And once I'd removed that, there was a reduction in papers again. So it's I think the one thing I learned from just following it this way is that you have to be flexible and iterative, almost playful. No, that hasn't worked. Let me try this.
Sorry, can I jump in?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Thank you, Rita. This very, very interesting presentation. It's very useful and helpful to see how you have conducted this search. And very useful. Thank you so much for that. My question, or probably it's not a question, but it is. So when we normally do a systematic review or similar, we start with the process by having some research questions. My thinking is, when you did it, did you ever run back to say, wow, are my research questions clear? Should I change my research questions? I know that you said at some points that you stick with your focus, but did you go back to revise your research questions given the results probably not giving you what you were looking for? Could you explain?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't looking for anything in particular apart from getting a sense of what have we done and what have we found out, and that the purpose of that was to develop a more specific question. So I started off very broadly, essentially, what do we know about education in the Indian diaspora? And it's the gaps that it revealed that have helped me to develop more focused research questions. So it is almost a filter-like process, filtration process, if you like. So now I'm starting to think about those themes that emerged and the framework and how to start to conceptualize more conceptually driven, I would say, focused questions.
Right, thank you.
Thanks, Rita. We have a raised hand from Liz.
Thank you. Thanks, Rita. It's so useful to see step by step the process. So I'm really grateful that you shared that with us. It was just a question around, how do you know when you've done enough? How do you know when to stop? I mean, I work reflexively and iteratively. It's sort of in my nature, but how do you get a sense that you've done enough and you need to stop?
I think for me, it's when it starts to become manageable. Okay. So, I got to 85 papers, and the work still comes in. It may not always be relevant, but I think that's really, for me, starts to become the defining criteria for my purpose, which was, I've got a handle on the landscape now. I can see where most of it's going on. I can see there's a temporal dimension, a spatial dimension going on, and what are the things that it's revealing in terms of knowledge and this area being diasporic experience, I suppose, and the gaps. And for me, that was enough to say, okay, I can manage with that, and I can start to think, where do I go from here in terms of more focused questions? Because I've got a conceptual framework now, I've got some studies that link in with that, and I've got some gaps. It's enough for me to say, okay, where do I want to channel my next bit of research?
Thank you, thanks.